Beautiful. Well, hello, hello, hello to anybody who is tuning into this conversation today. As promised, I am once again bringing some new people to join in our conversation, a public discussion about what is happening at Laurentian. And the ripple effect that has on the post-secondary sector here in Waterloo Region, but also across the province. 2 days ago, I began this conversation with members of faculty associations in Waterloo Region. And the starting point was to be partially because I was receiving a number of emails and letters from folks that were saying two things. They were witnessing faculty members, tenured faculty members, lose their jobs, which is very rare and unheard of and sent chills through the sector. And so I wanted to start off with faculty to talk to me a little bit about what they were hearing on the ground, etc. But also because there was a very public call from some unions, more community leaders and such, and academics have been calling for the minister, Ross Romano, to resign. And as much as I understand that when you don't invest in the sector, there will be consequences and people will want better from you. I do not believe that the removal of a minister without a clear understanding of what it is that we need to from the leadership of the sector will actually solve all of our problems. And so what I wanted to do was to get different voices to join in this conversation. Started with faculty. Yesterday I got an opportunity. I was truly blessed to talk to staff representatives as well as contract academic staff representatives and somebody from a TA association and a grad student. And today's conversation is going to be what I think is the heart of the sector. This is a conversation with the students and with family members of post-secondary students. It is so critically important that we center the real experiences of students across any post-secondary institution, and we ensure that every decision that we make is one that supports, holds, cares for the students, because literally that is the purpose of having the sector. So with me today, I have Sébastien Lalonde. So Sébastien is a Franco-Ontarian, a queer grad student from York University. And I graduated from York University. I graduated from so many universities, but I also graduated from York University. So shout out to York. You are also the current chairperson for the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario, serving as the official spokesperson of the organization representing over 350,000 students. So thank you, Sébastien, for joining us. I also have with me Kayla Wheeler-Fox, who is the National Executive Representative for the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. Thank you, Kayla, for joining. And I have Trina Shepherd, who I'm going to tell you a story about Trina, but it's not because I don't have stories about everybody else, but just so that folks know, Trina is a parent in the Waterloo Region community, in my community. And Trina had reached out. She provides career and life coaching for students and community members. And that is all really, really, really important. But what I think is most important is that Trina reached out to me because they are a parent of a student in post-secondary. And they realized that everything that was happening within the sector was so impactful on their own child, but also on other students in the sector. And then they Trina mobilized a number of parents in Waterloo Region to sign petitions and demand better. So I just wanted to take a minute to explain that as I introduced Trina, because people don't realize the ripple effect even within a person's family. When we don't provide the support to the student, parents are at their wits' end trying to find ways to provide that support and make up for what should be happening, in my opinion, from the leadership in government to protect the sector. And then we also have thank you, Trina. Thank you for joining us. And we also have with us Aisha Masoor, who is a coordinator for the Racial Advocacy for Inclusion, Solidarity, and Equity, or RAISE, at UW. So thank you, thank you, thank you all for joining. We are live streaming everything, which is amazing. People will have an opportunity to participate. You can put questions into the chat wherever you're watching it, whether you're watching it on YouTube or you're watching it on our Facebook feed. But I'm going to stop all of my chit chatter and I'm going to send it over to you folks. I would like us to start where people's hearts are, and what I am hearing is that people's hearts are with the folks in Sudbury and at Laurentian. I am wondering if I will randomly pick a person. I'm going to start with Sébastien. Sébastien, can you please tell me what it is that you are hearing in your networks of students about the impact of the government's decision not to invest and not to save Laurentian during these critical times?
I just cut out there. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. Uh-oh, has it frozen or is it just freezing for me? Is Sebastian frozen?
I think he is.
He is? Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you, Kayla, to jump in. I'm going to remove Sebastian, bring him back in, and see if I can make him come back. But over to you. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, sounds great. So part of like Sebastian and I, people that we work with is the students' unions at Laurentian University. So in particular, the Francophone Students' Union, as well as the Grad Students' Union. We've heard a lot of stories from students that on the day of the insolvency announcement or the program cuts announcement, that they were writing their like 3 exams so that they could finish their program in French. And that's definitely like where we're hearing the bulk of from students is that the fact that they're so worried and concerned that they're not able to finish their degree at Laurentian, and especially for folks who are trying to finish their degree in French or in Indigenous studies, for the fact that like these are unique programs to Laurentian. We also heard from graduate students that their research money is in jeopardy. And this is research money that they've attracted to Laurentian University for the research that they're doing locally for that community. So it's like really heartbreaking to hear that all of the work that students have put in for over several years is simply in jeopardy because of this process. And that's like heartbreaking. I was never in a program that was cut, but when I was at the University of Guelph, a lot of programs were cut. And that was only when there was, a handful of programs, which are any program cut is a loss. Absolutely. So I could just not even imagine what it's like for these folks to know that they can't even finish their degree in math or political science at Laurentian because those programs are completely gone.
Thank you so much for that, Kayla. I'm hearing the same thing. I'm hearing, I was actually on a Zoom call, an emergency meeting on the day that the cuts were announced. And hearing from students, like just the heartbreak, because you take a lot, it is a real decision that you make, a big decision that you make when you choose your university and you choose your program. And I know even when I was in the system, when I was teaching, I used to have conversations with folks. It was a big decision to switch programs, right? Like even at the same institution, when you realize that you could really excel in another area or something was just speaking to you, and then to turn around and have it cut and not know what is going to happen next is heartbreaking. Sébastien, you are back. So unmute yourself and let me know. I know you came in sort of partially or partway through Kayla's answer as well. So what are you hearing on the ground from students in your network?
Yeah, I hope I'm not repeating what Kayla had already shared, but from what we're hearing is like the personal experiences of students having to essentially rush to finish their degrees, to finish their semesters. There are some pass-fail options for certain people in certain courses and certain programs. There are some options to either take a grade, and then other students are essentially being forced to have to take 3-4 exams in a single day to make sure that they meet the deadline before the CCAA process, officially takes place and the layoffs happen. And so the amount of precarity that we're putting these students in, on top of already the highest tuition fees, on top of the lowest per student funding, students are already struggling in the province. And this is just a really, really severe, I'm going to say, lack of care on the side of the government and also of the administration at Laurentian University to care for their students and their academic well-being and well-being as a whole, really.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastien. I can also, it's interesting to have, this is the third conversation, as I was saying earlier, and certain words keep coming up. The word precarity keeps coming up in these discussions. Precarity of work, a reminder of how precarious our programs can be, depending on whether or not we get the investment, the financial investment to keep them going, especially if you are enrolled in a unique type of program. So you would sort of think on the ground, and I'm going to hand this over to you, Aisha, in just a second, but you sometimes assume that programs that deal with racial justice or racial equity, so something like that Indigenous Studies program being so unique, not just at Laurentian and not just for Sudbury, but literally for the province and for the country to have a program like that, or the midwifery program, that's providing such a specific service to the population there, that there would be more investment from government to ensure that it can be sustained, right? And I'm kind of going to move our conversation over to you, Aisha, also to find out what you're hearing with that word in the background, precarity, because I think when it comes to the kind of work that I see you doing in community, because I see you, the kind of work that I see you doing in community, the kind of conversations that you're pushing on university campuses, I'm wondering if you're hearing from folks who are already kind of in this precarious position in a university setting already, how they're feeling when they think about what's happening at Laurentian.
Of course. So obviously my perspective is a bit different. Like, I'm a Waterloo undergraduate student, and Waterloo is a very privileged university. We, because of the way we're set up, will never face the kind of barriers Laurentian is facing. But I think coming from the perspective of working within racialized student communities who are always aware from the minute they step on this campus or the minute they enter the education system that their status is always in some level of precarity, whether that's because of the institutional racism, whether that's because of more implicit barriers. Seeing something like that happen to a university, it shakes your limited faith as racialized students in the institutions to go, like, if that can happen to Laurentian, what does that mean for somebody like Waterloo or Laurier or the many other really wonderful institutions we are fortunate enough to be a part of? I think for racialized students who are very disenfranchised by the system, seeing that an entire university can just let go of people that have the most privilege within those structures, it's like, then tomorrow anything could happen to any of us, and we really aren't protected in any way. And all the work we're doing to pay fees, to be in these programs, to be able to enter workforces and continue to do really good change, none of that is guaranteed. And as students, we're always operating in precarity, right? A lot of us are dependent on OSAP, a lot of us are dependent on other factors that allow us to be here. And if something like Laurentian can be dissolved so quickly, anything can be dissolved just as quickly. So I think it reinforces for students that as much as we're fed the myth of, Canada has free education, and in Ontario in particular, supported in your dreams of achieving what you want, regardless of your background, we all know from far before we step on this campus that's not real, but this is a really significant way to reinforce for students that they are not necessarily a priority in the system. And what is a priority is the money they can contribute, and the money is not a guarantee to anything. So I think a lot of what I'm hearing is just stress and fear compounded by it's the end of winter term and students are expected to, as Sebastian said, operate as though nothing is happening and graduate and like move on while these really big things are happening that are determining their careers. So I think on the everyday, students are just really, really scared of what to expect and how that's going to work out. And students feel excluded because there's no room for them to actually speak to what's happening. They can't be included in these processes. As much as they affect us, nobody's really interested in hearing what we have to say. Sarah, I believe you're still muted.
Yes. Thanks, Aisha. As you can see, Laura May is not here anymore. She's having some technical issues, so it's frozen, and she's attempting to sort of restart and rejoin. I don't think I'll take over hosting, but I thought maybe everyone could unmute, and I'm sure you've had some thoughts as this discussion has been progressing, and you can feel free to sort of add some comments here and there if you'd like. Let's see how that goes. Okay, Kayla?
Yeah, actually, like something I wanted to talk about, and thank you, Aisha, for bringing this up, is like the fact that students hadn't had the input to talk about what's happening at Laurentian, and also to just like any college or university across the province, across the country, because oftentimes like student seats on the Board of Governors or the Senate are limited to 1 or 2 students, and it's been kind of a whirlwind to help support the folks at Laurentian who do hold those seats, and the amount of stress that they're under right now to like bring forward all of the concerns of students, like that's a lot of pressure placed on one student who's also a full-time student to do all of that work. So it's like our institutions, if they really want to hear from students, they should create the spaces and allow students to have those spaces to make those decisions, but also to like Board of Governors have a lot of corporate people on them that like make these decisions for us when it's like our campus community should be making those decisions. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in.
Hello, I'm back. So for all those watching, this is now like the 3rd time in my life where I have been kicked out of my own live stream, which is hilarious. I don't know if it's the universe talking to me or what. So I'm going to try and be kinder and gentler to everybody. I'm now officially on my personal hotspot on my cell phone. So please pray for me. Send me positive energy to see if this keeps going. So thank you for that. I'm sure everything that you said while I was struggling was absolutely brilliant. And did you folks have a chance to hear from Trina yet? Or am I going to ask Trina? Okay, I'm going in, Trina. It's you and me. So I am curious to know, as a parent, and with your connections in community with other parents of post-secondary students, are you hearing folks, even here, talking about what is happening at Laurentian, or seeing what is happening at Laurentian, and what kinds of concerns might they be relaying to you, or do you just sort of have as you're listening to this conversation?
I mean, not specifically about Laurentian, and certainly I'm on lockdown as much as everybody else, so I don't have the same connection with parents as I do typically. But I will tell you that it always comes back to haunt us when we don't invest in education and our young people's futures, which is our future. And I think that we will rely heavily on the students today to restore our economy tomorrow. So I think that in general, parents are really feeling the need to support the kids so that they're able to focus on getting their education, focusing on marketability, and that will be fundamental to re-stimulating the community, or re-stimulating the economy rather. And I think that that's the general consensus of the parents. Certainly when I went out with that petition that you mentioned earlier, it was overwhelming support. I almost didn't have to tell the story. People had their own stories they wanted to share with me, and saying, we need to give the students a voice. And the students are so busy trying to do and focus on what they're focused on right now, which is what they're supposed to be doing, that we as parents feel like we need to get more involved, and we want to advocate and help them, recognizing it's going to help us as much as anybody else.
You know what? Thank you so much for that, because I do, one of the other pieces that I was hearing when I think about what the connections that I do have with folks, or the meetings that I've had with people that are out in Sudbury, there is a clear connection between what happens on post-secondary campuses and what happens in the broader community. And in smaller communities, that connection is even stronger. And so one of the big issues that we heard right away, just when the announcement for the CCAA process began and insolvency was announced, people were worried about the local economy in Sudbury.
Absolutely.
Right? They were worried about what that was going to mean for the craft services, which, sometimes on our campuses, those are local businesses that are bringing food in. They were worried about the custodial staff and the janitorial staff and all of these other folks that we don't always think about as part of the university's network, but
Absolutely.
they're real, and we need to think about them. So then it brings it right back to where you were speaking it to, Trina, with the notion of investing, because this is all happening in the midst of a pandemic. This pandemic is forcing us to think about economic recovery, and economic recovery is forcing us to think about, why didn't we invest in certain areas before? Right? Because now here we are. And so let's move our conversation into that space. I believe, I've said this in the last couple sessions that I've had with folks, I believe really, really strongly that we have to speak into being what we want to see in the world. We need to speak it into being. And so what I do hear all the time is what we don't have. So I know what the lack of investment looks like. It looks like the government not choosing to save Laurentian. It looks like them deciding it's better to cut programs than to ensure that these programs, especially the most unique of the programs, are provided with the investment. But if you focus on that, sometimes you're putting too much energy into that negative space, into what we don't have. So I want us to flip the script. I want us to talk about what we want on a university campus. What is it that students need in order to thrive? So I'm going to start with you, Trina. Based on everything that you're seeing, conversations with parents, the petition, because people won't know what's in that petition, what is it that you would want to see from the minister? What would you want them to be advocating for so that you would feel confident that the students, your kids, are given every opportunity to thrive in post-secondary?
I mean, that's a loaded question. I don't have all the answers. What I would start by saying is that it's really about prioritizing education as a basic human right. I think that we need to, in terms of looking for a minister or somebody capable of taking that post and defining solutions, we not only have to have recognize the importance of the social and economic investment in public education, but also for the students. The minister would also need to bring the appropriate skill set to the table that would be able to identify what is the specific problem and to provide solutions that are quantifiable and realistic and measurable. So I find that a lot of times there's the solutions and the scope is so large that nobody really knows, well, what does that mean? What is it that you're looking for? What would that cost us to do that? And if we did invest that money, what would that bring to the table? So I think if we had the right people with the right skill sets asking for specifically what we need, you're absolutely right, Laura May. I think that we do a lot of complaining about what we don't have, but when somebody says, well, what do you want? We go, oh, well, enough thought and preparation isn't done into that conversation. So I think the skill sets to the table, asking direct questions, what is the problem? Let's make sure that the scope is nice and tight so that we can ask for something and we know what it's going to cost us and we have the direct benefit on implementation. And then certainly the risk of not implementing too. I think that there's power in explaining this is what's going to happen if you don't start to invest in this. And I think Laurentian is a perfect example of that. It all happened so fast. It didn't seem to be a lot of information communicated about it. Suddenly it was all a done deal and we're all kind of reacting to it. And I think this knee-jerk type reaction, specifically in this sector, is really scary. I think that it has to have a lot more communication and a lot more participation from people who know what they're doing.
Thank you so much again for that, Trina. It's interesting. I'm also looking through some of the comments that are coming up. My friend Naru Philip is on there as well. Hi, Naru. One of the things that he mentioned as you were speaking, two things actually. One was that we need to so understanding the skill set means, or having the right skill set means understanding the sector, and understanding the sector means knowing that a university, as Aisha was saying before about the university is at UW is more privileged than the university like Laurentian in Sudbury. And so they will need different things. And there needs to be sort of differentiated understanding of what those universities require so that we can invest in that way. But you can't do that if you don't know about the sector. I believe I may have at one point rage tweeted school, I think it was just K to 12. I was trying to explain to the premier that schools are actually in our communities. So if you don't protect the community from community spread, then the schools too will be impacted. And I would argue the same thing for post-secondary. They are in our communities. So if you don't protect community and you don't understand what they need, then you are also not helping the sector and vice versa, right? I'm going to throw it over to Sébastien. Sébastien, what do you think? What is it that you would want to see in the minister? What kinds of things do you think should be sort of top of mind for any minister of colleges and universities?
Yeah, I'm going to break this down in three, I think, very distinct categories. And this applies as much to a solution for Laurentian University as it does for the entire post-secondary education sector in Ontario, right? The first thing is we have to make sure that there is funding available to entirely cover the costs of operating a post-secondary institution, whether it be a college or a university, making sure that there is no financial precarity, that there is job security for those employed, and that there's a security in folks' educational attainment for those students is top of mind. So let's make sure that these institutions are properly funded, that our universities and colleges don't have to depend on corporate partnerships to be able to sustain themselves, and they don't end up having not having to, but they don't end up poaching international students and charging them 3, 4, 5 times the rate of domestic students and putting that labor on their back. So that's the first one, is funding. Secondly is looking at governance. So how are our institutions dealt with? And we've talked about this a little bit. The Laurentian community did not have a say in how to deal with the financial precarity of its own institution. Our current universities and colleges, their board structures, their senate structures are not representative of the communities. They're representative of large business entities and folks who are outside of the university sector. And so why are these the folks making the large decisions that are going to impact students, staff, and faculty on our campuses across the province? It is nonsensical. We need to give governance back into the hands of the communities in which these institutions are found. And the very last thing I'll say is that we have made some very, very serious commitments as a government, as a country, as a province, to certain things. And one of them at Laurentian University, as a really good example, is our commitment to Francophone education, and secondly is to truth and reconciliation. And so the fact that the very two things that we have made commitments towards upholding to make sure that there's a preservation of language and culture, both within Franco-Ontarian communities, but especially within the various Indigenous communities that exist in Ontario, that preservation of language, that resurgence of Indigenous culture is one of only 2 programs in the entire province. And it's one of the oldest ones, and yet we've allowed it to simply disappear, even though we have a very, very clear commitment to Indigenous communities and to stop the ongoing colonialism that our governments upheld. And this is simply a product of that. So I think those 3 aspects really need to fall into our solution for a better post-secondary education system, and also is in part the answer to Laurentian's issue.
That was fantastic and so clear, which is the reason I'm raising that is because oftentimes people have a big problem and they don't go to students to ask for their input on how to solve it. And yet the clarity from the student body on what it is that they need to thrive is there. And so I'm with you, like having one person on a board of governors, at that table that represents the student voice makes no sense, because one student is insufficient to do that and oftentimes does not reflect the most vulnerable students. So making sure that you center the folks that need to be centered is hugely important in this sector. But another thing that you raised that I think is super important for us to keep in mind and keep central in our discussion is that there are certain students or certain people that never found access to the university space. And so part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions were an attempt to force people to face that, like face the reality of not having post-secondary accessible to Indigenous students or Indigenous people, and recognize the impact of that and do better. And so that, to me, also needs to be central, not just for this minister, but for all the ministers, so that somebody else would be looking at this minister and say, what are you doing? Because I think that's what they should do, right? Behind closed doors. I want my colleagues to turn around and say, Laura May, what are you doing? Right? If I'm responsible for something and I'm not doing it, hold me accountable. And we need that same kind of commitment to truth and reconciliation, in my opinion, not just in post-secondary, but across the board. I'm going to throw it over to you, Kayla. Can you give me a sense of what you would like to see in a minister and for the sector?
Yeah, totally. I think about this almost every day. I like to think about, like, what is the future of education in Ontario? And it's clearly not the path that we're going down right now. We're seeing the introduction of piecemeal reforms, these like funding schemes such as performance-based funding, using international students' tuition to help fund the system. And it's just making a mess out of our public education system, or our supposedly supposed to be public education system that doesn't receive enough public money to support it. I think the first thing when it comes to the Minister of Colleges and Universities is that this individual, whoever they are, should always first and foremost be willing to meet with the members of the community. So that looks like students and student organizations. It looks like meeting with the folks that represent faculty and workers on our campus, and not just the academic workers, they're fabulous and amazing, but also the trades workers on our campuses and support workers that make it run. We've, at the Canadian Federation of Students, we've had a bit of issue and trouble trying to meet with the minister and to have that one-on-one conversation about the sector. So it's just really interesting to see that, students and the folks who actually make our campuses run are being talked to about these major decisions before they're made. Another thing, I like to talk about how, the Federation, we like to go bold, and we're calling for free education, full stop. And when we talk about free education, it means across the country. Doesn't matter where you go to school, whether you go to school in Northern Ontario or in Southern Ontario, and regardless of your family's background or income, you should be able to access education for free. It's really despicable to see that students from low income families are continuously being kept of education, and OSAP does help, but it's just another barrier to have to apply for OSAP to pay for tuition. So that's like some of the things that we talk about as the Federation, for sure.
But those are so important. Like we have to be bold in this sector. We've got to recognize that in order for us to make the change and to ensure that everybody has access, I think we have to take these courageous, bold steps to do things differently. Because right now, the way the system is set up, it's not working for folks. And every time there's cuts to the base budget funding to a university, it's the students that suffer. Nobody else suffers. It's the students' tuition that goes up, or the parents that have to try and figure out how and if they're going to be able to keep the kids in school if they're also helping with tuition. And don't get me started on how expensive it is, like all the other peripheral expenses, books and access to computers and internet access, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a lot. So thank you for that. I'm going to throw it over to you, Aisha.
Yeah, I think those were all really awesome answers. And I don't think I can add too much, but I think what I can add in terms of what I would love to see in a minister is that lens of racial equity and understanding that as an individual, they are one person, so we can hire the greatest person on earth, but the system they are a part of will only let them do so much. So I think part one of that is finding someone who understands that universities are inherently colonial, they're inherently problematic because they're built on stolen land and they embody processes that heavily marginalize racialized students, but in particular Black and Indigenous students. And there's no version of that process that actually includes Black and Indigenous students, faculty, staff, regardless, like you are not a part of that structure. And I think that's something we don't do enough of when we have these conversations about university reform. We don't realize that it cannot happen, Dr. Lindo, as you said, in a vacuum. Like everything is impacted by the system, and the system is inherently anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. So every step of that conversation needs to be informed by that reality. And acknowledgement is amazing, right? And we can put up as many plaques as we want about stolen land, but we have to start to embed those processes in place. And I think funding is a big part of that, but when thinking of those funding solutions, recognizing that racialized communities are particularly disadvantaged, and not just racialized students from getting access, going as far back as students and their parents who are able to even get to university, or who are even able to consider that they would want to apply, because there are millions of ways we make racialized students within the education system as a whole not feel included. So I think there is a piece there where the Minister of Education definitely should be well versed on that race and its intersection to politics, but they should exist within a system that is also well versed. And so every conversation they have, they are held accountable because they're surrounded by a community that allows them to do so. And I think the piece of student intervention and student support is really important, and having students' voices heard. But students have been doing this for a really long time. And as we've shown today, students will continue doing this whether you give us a voice or not. We will use social media, we will use the communities we exist in. We don't need you to validate us. We need you to pay us, and we need you to listen to us, and we need you to change your processes. So every 3 years, there's not this, oh my God, students thought this was happening, right? We need to start having an institutional memory that goes like, students have been telling us this. And I'm sure students on Laurentian were well aware of what was happening far before it became public news and the newest topic of concern this week. So I think there's a big piece there going like, it's amazing that we are looking at reform, and I'm so happy that we're having these conversations. But the people at the very top that are so disconnected from what students are experiencing and seem to think that we're completely unaware of our circumstances, we always know what's happening. And if you start to connect with us, you can leverage your greatest resource to actually benefit you and create a system that benefits us collectively.
Oh, that is fantastic. And the only thing I would add is that then the people that are sort of responsible for providing the tools to the people that are at the top in these institutions, if they are disconnected, we are in what I like to call, in my professional opinion, a hot mess. And so with that, here's what I think. What I am hearing, and we have a couple more conversations to go, what I am hearing loud and clear is that the situation at Laurentian is not a one-off situation. It is a consequence of a lack of investment in the sector that has been long-standing. I am hearing that because of that, there is precarity within the sector built in at kind of all levels. From the amount of people that are contract academic staff members. We didn't talk about that in this conversation, but I've been hearing it it is a thread. The folks that are actually teaching you are in precarious situations, which leaves students in precarious situations, which leaves parents in precarious situations, which leaves all of us in community in a precarious situation. And I am hearing they have a system yet that centers them in a real way, that takes their experiences seriously and centers them in the building of a solution. I believe that we can do better. I really do. And I believe that we can be creative in the solutions that we come up with, but none of that will happen if we are not clear about what it is that we want. And so thank you all so, so much for spending some time with me. Apologies again for my internet access. We also need better infrastructure for broadband. Just saying, just going to throw that out there, and two-way all day go while I'm advocating for stuff. But I just want to say thank you for joining me in this conversation, for being very honest and open with me. And I promise you that I will use every tool that I have available to me to keep advocating and fighting for this sector. I truly, truly, truly feel blessed to have this critic portfolio, and absolutely honored to be sharing space with all of you brilliant, brilliant folks. So with that, thank you to everybody who joined us in this conversation, for the lovely comments and all of that fun stuff. The conversation is going to keep going. I've got another group of people, I think, that are coming up next. Yeah, stay safe, everybody, and we will all be together soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Laura May.